This is not a one year or 10-year project. This is going to be the project of a lifetime. It's going to be understanding how deep these changes. Again, at minimum, the internet is a change on the order of the printing press. It's a very, very deep shift in human history, and we need to take it seriously.
This is not a business where you take polls. It's a business where you think. You're not right or wrong because 1,000 people agree with you.
Per dimostrare che 2 più 2 fa 4.
Yeah, sounds good. Everything good? Cool. All right. John, good to have you on the podcast, man.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on, and in person, nonetheless. So you're assistant professor of politics at Catholic University, senior fellow at the Foundation of American Innovation. But most recently, you've been writing a series called Reality Postmortem on the new Atlantis. And we figured there's a breadth of stuff we can talk with you about, and we'll get to all of it, including, hopefully, drones. But figured we'd start with the new Atlantis pieces. Why don't you give us an overview? We'll link them in the show notes, but why don't you give us an overview of that project and why you've spent so much time writing and thinking about it?
Yeah, it's a true passion project in the sense of something I felt I had to write. It's an attempt at a more or less comprehensive account of the death of consensus reality, the death of a kind of shared sense of even what the facts are about the world, which I argue in the series is very much a product of the media environment, of the one-to-many communication systems, printing press, newspapers, television, radio, and its replacement by many-to-many communication systems in the internet. And an account of what is coming next and kind of the new rules for media, but really the new rules for building reality communities for the foreseeable future, as the internet kind of comes into its own. So it's ambitious. We start off with an essay kind of explaining the rules of the road, called "Reality is Just a Game Now." We look at what's happened to the world of news media in How Stuart Made Tucker. We look at the world of science and why it seems that facts aren't enough anymore. Why it seems that fact checks are just a move in a game; they're not a really serious thing. What was the fact? The next essay, called "An America of Secrets: Democracy Dies in Darkness," is on conspiracy theories and the truth about them, which is hidden in plain sight, which is that conspiracy theories are caused by actual secrets. We can dive into what I mean by that. And then we have a few more essays coming out on politics, economics, and ending with artificial intelligence.
Yeah. What's cool, what I really enjoyed about the series so far, because you haven't published all of it, was you were sort of tackling these questions that usually are, like, the left tries to talk about them a lot, like disinformation, misinformation. Like, why are these things that are part of the internet and part of internet culture? Why is it that a lot of how the internet is mediated is sort of through this fun, almost like riotous way of interacting?
Yeah, there's a certain jouissance that's sort of intrinsic to the internet.
Yeah. And people are gonna get the sense that that's how we connect with one another.
Yeah,
these days. And in some parts due to the internet. And the left, says bad misinformation. You're cheating at the game essentially, so you can't do that. You're booted.
Yeah.
But you were not approaching it from that perspective. You're sort of trying to figure out why the shape of the internet, the shape of the tools that we're using to mediate reality, or how they're affecting how we view each other, how we view the world, how we interact with other people. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamic of fun on the internet?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think it's the most important thing to understand about the internet. Like many of us, I kind of grew up. I'm a digital native, and I was on the messaging boards in middle school, even on dial-up internet in my parents' basement. And what you realized quickly was that the fun of the internet was the fun of connection, the fun of sharing. There is the internet is a kind of gift economy, right? And the gifts that you bring are posts, right? Whether they're funny memes, they're jokes, they're unique videos, and in particular communities that care about particular issues or narratives or stories, it's things that contribute to the ongoing development of that bigger story, right? And I think this is true of all internet communities for a number of reasons. Again, it's a kind of post-scarcity environment, right? So like posting is free. So what becomes valuable is what is valuable to the community. That's a big part of it. Part of it is the, humans have always connected by sharing ideas with each other. I mean, what we think about the human mind and language, right, is that these are tools that developed to deepen our evolutionary past precisely to help us connect and communicate in groups. Something very deeply human about this instinct, and the internet is our biggest expression of it yet. And there's a saying from some of the great media theorists of the 20th century that whatever you see on television is a television show, right? That no matter what it is, whether it's a soap opera or a drama or a comedy or a documentary or the nightly news, the affordances of television are going to fundamentally shape what it is, right? Like, you can be nightly news, you can be talking about some like a school shooting, and then you're gonna cut in for ads, and the ads you're gonna get are gonna be like a furniture store and a car dealership, or so like the affordances of it shape what it is. And I think similarly for the internet, everything on the internet is a post, whether it's CNN breaking news or somebody posting a meme, everything's a post, and you succeed by leaning into the affordances that creates. And this has also had a dramatic effect on our culture at large. Nobody can avoid this. Even large corporations, even like the New York Times. If you read New York Times headlines, they're not newspaper headlines anymore. They're internet headlines. They're formulated to fit in, not in the way that we think and in what's going to generate clicks. Now, this isn't BuzzFeed. The New York Times is a subscription-based system. We could talk about why it's important that the internet lives on subscriptions, not on ads. But this kind of change in a media ecology takes decades to fully work itself out in the culture, even centuries. Yeah. And one of the motivations of the series is to begin to take the internet seriously. Like this is not a one year or 10-year project. This is going to be the project of a lifetime. It's going to be understanding how deep these changes. And again, at minimum, the internet is a change on the order of the printing press, which introduced a fundamentally new media ecology and a fundamentally new sense of reality, which is what we talk about in the series. It's possible the internet is actually a level at the change of like introducing writing systems. But it's a very, very deep shift in human history, and we need to take it seriously.
You hear people all the time talking about something similar to when you go from an oral tradition to a written tradition. Yeah, that essentially devalues the ability to memorize things. Yeah, sure. You hear people talk about it in similar terms with the advent of the internet, where they say my attention span is shot. I can't read books or sit for 5 minutes before I pull out my phone and scroll through whatever. And those little kind of statements that people make that indicate in my mind like a fundamental, enormous shift between whatever you want to call it, one technological age to another, where the human being has changed because of the technology they use.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things we talk about, kind of going back to the fun in the internet, we talk about this a lot here at the office, just with kind of like everything that's going on right now. But a couple of examples come to mind, like Twitter acquisition of Twitter, even 18 months ago, 2 years ago, the GameStop.
I love that.
All of that stuff. Even if you want to get into more serious things, that there's the question floating around Twitter sometimes where it's like, would the Ukraine war have happened without Reddit? There's this fundamental fun energy that is being channeled to have impact in the real world in ways that I don't think we've quite fully grasped.
Absolutely.
The GameStop stuff is insane to me. The movie's coming out soon.
Yeah.
You had these people who wanted to. They saw, some of them saw an interesting opportunity to make money and were very scientific about it, and then others saw an opportunity to stick it to the hedge funds and Citadel, all this stuff. But for the most part, people just did it because it was fun.
Yeah. Did it for the lulz. Like this is like the original internet motivation for anything.
Yeah.
And one of the points of the series is like that's an extremely powerful motivation that, even above and beyond other kinds of incentives, right? Because I think if we're really careful about it, I don't think it's, they say they're willing to lose money, and that's true. They definitely were willing to lose cash, but it wasn't for nothing. It was potentially exchanging money for other kinds of currency, right? Currency of kudos on Reddit, of upvotes, the currency of likes, the currency of being part of the shared experience, right? And it's once you pay attention to this issue, you see there are lots of ways where people are willing to exchange very valuable things for those kind of internet experiences. I mean, it's like some of the biggest MMORPGs, which are only going to grow more powerful and interesting in the next 20 years. People spend tens of thousands of dollars getting the costumes, getting the
purple skin for your gun.
Getting the skins, getting the in-game items that they want for their characters. And actually, what's going to take us to the next level is Web3, is when these things actually become tradable property. Because the thing that's actually holding back the internet right now is that any money you spend on the internet is almost by definition a temporary thing. Right. As soon as we get tradable property on the internet, like the amount of money people are going to be willing to invest in the internet property is just going to shoot up. Yeah. It's going to go through.
So that world that exists in a specific game where you say, in this game, I own the sword and I own my cloak. That's going to be expanded to the entire internet where you say, on the internet, I own this sword and this cloak and I can take it.
And so the kinds of meaning and value people accrue, and you can actually treat it as an investment in a way you can't really treat it now, except for like maybe some cryptocurrencies. So, I mean, there are other examples too. We, in my very first essay in the series, we talked about intelligence leaks related to basically posting, like impressing your friends on the internet, right? And we feel really anticipated the kind of Jack Texera leaks, like one of the biggest, arguably the biggest leak of military intelligence in post-Cold War history, for a guy trying to impress his friends in his Discord, right? And that was his real motivation. Yeah. What's funny is when that first came out, there was this huge... Can
you give some background to that? I know the story.
Yeah, so for folks at home who weren't following, in March, I think it was March of this year, was it March or was it May?
I think March was when the first leaks happened.
Okay, then it kind of goes...
they cracked down on it in May.
Yeah. So basically starting in March, some like very... powerful intelligence started to leak in like weird places. I think and in May when it kind of first came to people's attention when it was posted on a big Telegraph channel that people were paying attention to. That piece was actually falsified, indicating like this actual piece of disinformation said that Ukrainian losses were much higher, that the U.S. military believed the Ukrainian losses were much higher than publicly acknowledged, Russian losses much lower. That wasn't actually true. The actual slide, when they found it, was more or less what you would expect. People began to trace back a series of really significant leaks of very high-level U.S. intelligence and intelligence analysis of the war in Ukraine, and later turns out of the situation in Taiwan, and a number of other things. And they traced it back ultimately to first a large and then a smaller Discord server of chat room of like 40 people that this guy was posting, top secret U.S. military intelligence to. And obviously he was caught because he was not, operational security was not very high. And it was this random, like Air Force, Air National Guard intelligence analyst from Massachusetts. And what's interesting is when this first came out, there was a huge generational divide in the national security community, because you had like boomers who were saying like, who first thought this was like a Russian hack or some kind of ideological based thing,
Soviet level, Cold War level,
or thought it was just crazy, like this is crazy. And then there were all them like the millennials and younger were like, yeah, makes sense. Like every millennial I talked to, working in national security, instantly knew what this was. Like as soon as this came out, I was like, obviously somebody is posting to impress their internet friends. And it was just interesting because it was obvious that was something you might do to a millennial or a Zoomer, and it was completely unconscionable to a boomer.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, and I wrote a piece with Renee DiResta in Foreign Policy about this, is when you actually go back and look carefully at most of the recent leaks, Edward Snowden, Reality Winner, what's the WikiLeaks stuff?
Julian Assange.
Yeah. Julian Assange, but also Chelsea Manning or whatever. You actually see that their motivations are very shaped by their engagement with the internet, and in some cases, arguably like internet communities. Like I think that if you read the Chelsea Manning trial, like if you read the actual testimony and evidence, it's very clear that the motivation was first and foremost about like pleasing like the WikiLeaks chat group.
It's not Daniel Ellsberg.
It wasn't Daniel Ellsberg. It wasn't really like political. Like the reason the first WikiLeaks that was leaked was this random diplomatic cable from about Iceland. Right. It's like, well, why was that leaked? Because there was an argument on the WikiLeaks IRC channel about Iceland being manipulated by the U.S. around banking in the financial crisis. Yeah. And this was like a piece of evidence. It was a gift, it was like, here's something for this discussion from this top secret database.
I mean, you can imagine this. I mean, no group chat that assimilates these kinds of things. But if you're
for the feds in our audience, we are not involved in any top secret.
But if you're even something like, what's going on with war in Ukraine, or even like, let's say the Elon Musk takeover. If you have people, if you're in a group chat, you're discussing like, how's it gonna play out? Is he gonna fire 90% of the staff? Is it gonna be 60? And then somebody maybe there knows Elon Musk, and this is totally theoretical, but somebody then says like, oh, I have inside information. He will leak it to the group chat. You can imagine him leaking to the group chat because he just wants to contribute to the group chat. Not because he's thinking, here we go, I'm gonna be the Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers of the Musk takeover, anything like that.
Absolutely. But I think this is very fundamental to like the social structure of the internet and actually the social structure of society today. Like it's become really important which group chats you're a part of. Like it can, as someone who thinks for a living, it's hugely shaping of both the information you receive and then also the audience that you have. And this is a new development, I think, in the last 15 years. And there was a period, right, in which it seemed like public social media could have this function. And I think we're now past that period. But the result is an additional fragmentation of reality, right? Like literally your sense of reality depends on which group chats you're a part of.
Right. Yeah. Which backroom is kind of helping you shape the facts that everybody, you kind of like, it's like let's say you're on Twitter. Twitter is the top of funnel fact dump where everybody gets every fact that's possibly out there. And then if you happen to be on the group chat with Matt Taibbi and a couple of those guys, then it'll shape the structure of reality that way. If you happen to be in a group chat with right-wing and on guys, it's going to shape it in a particular way. The same facts, you talk about this in some of your pieces, the same facts can have literally the same facts. You can have the most wildly opposing narratives constructed out of the same building blocks.
Yes, that's right. And then you see a kind of contestation. But what's interesting, right, is in the world of consensus reality, what you would have would be like a contesting the narrative about the facts, right? So if you go back and if you can torture yourself to watch like late 90s TV debate shows, you'll see that. By the way, they're almost impossible to watch. Like it's hard to think. Even things I watched growing up, you go back and watch them now, and your mentality has been so reshaped by this new media ecology that it's almost impossible to watch them. But you go back and you watch, and there is a shared sense of what the facts are. And then what they're contesting is what the narrative is going to be. Because in this media environment, only 2 to 4 narratives can even be circulating at any given time, right? This is kind of the deep structure of why you have like polarization and like red versus blue on television and media. I think in the 80s and 90s was, it was again, everything on TV is a television show, right? You can have a television show with 2 debate partners, and then the news, what gets to count as facts and news is determined by what gets shown on the evening news, right? There's actually this huge like funnel of reality of like things that aren't even quote unquote newsworthy. Even the idea of something being, we think about that, like the idea of something being newsworthy assumes that that the news is scarce, that there's one place you can get the news, and that there's a kind of rank ordering of what gets to be the news, right? That just is completely gone now, right? And so instead what you have are are different communities with entirely different notions of what is newsworthy or not, surfacing facts, and the same facts can circulate in different communities and be taken up in different ways. One example I use in the piece was when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wore the kind of tax the rich dress to, which is like a total social media play, and it was a huge hit. It was a huge hit in part because it was a hit in different communities, right? The DSA folks thought this was like a bold artistic statement. Obviously, a lot of folks in like right-wing communities of different kinds thought this was like hugely hypocritical and made fun of it. But actually, from the standpoint of the internet, it doesn't matter whether you're making fun of it or not. It's still circulating it to a higher degree. And that in some ways is actually a bad example, because I think it'd be more interesting to think of some facts that circulate in multiple completely different ways in different communities.
What are examples of those?
That's what I'm trying to think of right now. And the political examples that kind of come most easily to mind.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about in that essay about you give kind of a sort of like a John Nash, beautiful mind sort of framing of saying now in the internet, there's so much information where all of us can turn into John Nash, where we have access to every single granular piece of information. And so your mind can create narratives, or you can jump into whatever portion you want to. How do you think about navigating that yourself? Like, you've thought about it a lot. Like, how do you swim in those waters?
Yeah. Oh, before I get to that, just to get back to your question, Santiago, I think the kind of ongoing media, the ongoing kind of public discussion about RFK Jr. is an interesting example. Like, he's a figure who either appeals or discusses different communities for like very different reasons. So, like, for example, you know, he has obviously very strong appeal to like the anti-vaxxer world, which is his own thing. Then you got photos of him talking about like CIA killed my father or killed my uncle. Like, that appeals to a different constituency. You got that, video of him.
The deep state boys are all.
Yeah. You video of him like weightlifting or whatever. That's so he, as a figure, I think you can't understand his appeal. Like, if the 20th century politician, like political figure par excellence, like a JFK or a Reagan, was someone who had a very strong brand that everyone knew what their brand was, I think RFK Jr. is an example of a kind of post-reality figure whose your sense of what his brand is completely dependent on which reality community you're a part of.
Which fandom.
Yeah, which fandom you're a part of. Yeah, Catherine D uses this notion. It's a good framework. So getting back to your question, I think it's a tough one. I think I'd say two things. One, not taking yourself too seriously about this. Like, I think like the thing that's so off-putting about the way we often talk about news media and misinformation, it's so self-serious and so dumb and so unwilling to deal with reality as it now is. So I don't take it too seriously. I don't take myself too seriously in that regard. I think I'm careful. I try to be careful about. You have to recognize that you have to choose which networks you're going to be a part of, and that is a choice that is also a choice about what kind of reality you're going to live in. So taking that seriously. Alex Kashuta, I was on Alex Kashuta's podcast earlier this year, and she said something which then she later wrote as an article in the American Conservative, which I recommend to you. And in our discussion, you said that like which reality-based community or fandom or whatever you choose to be most involved in sets like your view of the kind of win condition for your life. Mm-hmm. I think it's a very important ethical choice. So, so to some extent, work your way back from like, what kind of life do I want to live? What kind of life do I want to be pursuing? What are the communities that are most encouraging of and shaping of and demonstrating of that way of living? Mm-hmm. And then, so that should shape your kind of
and realize that when you log in, you're not just accessing reality on the internet.
That's right.
You are actively choosing and navigating information.
And then at the same time, also being open to the fact that it's always going to be by definition partial. I think this is one of the key mistakes people make on the internet is that when they get too far down the rabbit hole they get internet brainworms, is that they think that their access to their reality community is is ground truth.
Right.
And that's just never going to be the case on the internet. And that's okay. Like, it doesn't have to be the case. I think it's important then to also cultivate ways of touching grass, as the kids say, of rooting oneself in real physical spaces and physical communities. Although I think that is also, we have to be careful about the assumptions buried in that as well. I think it's easy to underestimate the ways that internet communities become real physical communities. And I think this, you guys in New Founding, I think, are at the forefront of realizing this is the future. Like, people are going to move to real places, in part shaped by their engagement with different reality communities on the internet.
Yeah. I'm curious about that. So anytime you talk to somebody who thinks about the internet and the way Twitter, social media shapes our perception of reality, they either fall sort of subconsciously in one camp or the other. And I don't have examples at the top of the mind, but I keep track. Some people will say, when you go on social media, which is not real life, by the way. And other people will say, when you go on social media, which is part of real life. And again, sort of unconsciously, you have these two camps. Do you think Twitter, Facebook, Reddit are real life or not?
Yeah, I
Which camp are you in?
I believe a cooler, more sophisticated third thing.
Third way, okay. Third way.
No, but I'm joking a little bit. I mean, I think it's obviously real life in a certain sense. Like, there was in one of his Netflix specials, Dave Chappelle has a whole riff about how Twitter's not real life, and I just think to myself, like, you're saying this in front of a crowd on a Netflix special, and you expect them to all to understand what you're talking about.
And you're gonna
so of course it's real life,
viral on Twitter.
and you're going to go viral on Twitter because of course it's real life. You're just not being attentive to the. So I think the Twitter here. There's a problem with both camps. The Twitter, social media, whatever, is not real life camp is naive about the way that the world is being shaped by, and they themselves are being shaped by these forces. And by the way, I should say I don't really like the term social media. I think it's more. People invest way too much in the particular platforms, and I think a lot of times when we talk about social media, we're just talking about the internet, right? It's not clear to me the affordances of internet relay chat forums or chat boards or Discord servers are that different from Twitter and social media, except for a few different ways.
Like you were saying,
everything's a post, right? The affordance, yeah. So the affordances maybe affect which audiences you reach, what goes viral, but the fundamental mechanisms are just the mechanisms of the internet. The Twitter is real life people, et cetera, are naive in two ways. One, maybe I think they're sometimes not always as conscious as they should be of the way that the affordances of the medium are shifting their sense of reality, right? Something that just because something goes viral, the most important things on Twitter, objectively, are not necessarily the things that are going to go viral, right? And if you are leaning into not just the communities or ideas or sense of reality or relationships, but the actual, if you're leaning into the feed as your way of engaging with any kind of social media, what you're in danger of is not so much the content. It's not the message, but the medium itself, right? That you are in the same way that if there's a lot of really wonderful media criticism from the era of television that looked at how this applied in the television era. I think it's useful to go back and read that, in part because it's so alien to where we are today, but it helps you get a sense of how deeply and quietly shaping these background forces can be. That's the first mistake to make. The second mistake, which is a key internet era mistake, is to forget that there is stuff outside of the internet. So if Twitter is real life, which I'll grant, real life is also still real life, right? Yeah. And some of the most important things that you can know, the most important ideas you can have, the most important realities and relationships you can have, you may not be able to have through that medium. And so, like, when I work on, you see this a lot now with national security stuff, because there is so much leaking and because there is so much online discussion of things, many people make the assumption that the internet is providing a realistic snapshot of some kind of ground truth. But particularly for national security, there's also this whole realm of secrets that have still been kept, that actually exerts and relationships and ideas and people that are not engaged on the internet, intentionally so in this case, that also have a huge shaping factor. So I think that this is a key problem of like open source intelligence of the internet age, is it forgets that there, even as open sources become more powerful, there actually are still stuff that you can't find on the internet. Yeah. And in fact, actually, as the internet grows more dominant, what is not on the internet becomes more valuable as it becomes more scarce. Like some of the most important ideas that you can think about are in books that you cannot find on the internet or can't find represented on the internet. So I think there's a weird way in which as the internet becomes more dominant, the realm of artifacts outside of the internet becomes more valuable as a result. And one of the key kind of sources of value will be people who are really good at going to the parts of reality that are illegible to the internet and finding what's valuable there.
Would it be bringing them onto the internet, or?
Yeah, in many cases, bringing them to their internet communities.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think too with now and in the next 5 years, as you can generate anything, text, speech, video, whatever you can imagine can be generated via AI. You can imagine, if you're a 5-year-old 5 years from now and I show you something on the internet and I say, okay, here's this, but it's not real. It was just generated by electricity. Your perspective would be like, okay, real world is real. Things that I see on screens are probably just purely made up. And so, again, like you're saying, the value of what's on the internet could drop to almost zero.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting implications of generative AI that I think people are really misguided about, right? Is, Marshall McLuhan has this notion of a reversal of like what happens to a technology when it's taken to its extreme is often the opposite of what you would expect. So like an automobile, like the first person to get an automobile got to go really fast. But when everyone has an automobile, you get traffic and suddenly you're going like a standstill, right? Similarly, on the internet, we've had this sort of asymptotically increasing posting of images, of videos, of text or whatever. And the assumption is like, oh, generative AI is going to take that to infinity, and everything's going to break. And it's like, no, it's going to take it to infinity, and it's actually going to obsolesce a lot of ways of doing things and retrieve other things. It's going to make it like generative AI is not going to drown human speech on the internet. It's actually going to take the value of bad human speech to zero and leave authentic human speech as the most valuable thing on the internet. It's actually going to be better than it is today. Similar thing with screens, right? Or with video and images, right? It's not going to drown real human expression. It's going to take the value of the kind of mediocre human expression we have today on the internet and drive its value to zero, and make it so the only way to demonstrate value is actually to have the best. So I'm very bullish on generative AI for this reason. Yeah. I think it will be important to, on the one hand, it will be important to. It's funny. There's some people who think that what we need to do is, because AI is so good at copying humans, that we need to, tag all AI speech or watermark all AI images. And there are some applications where that's probably a good idea. But at the same time, like, what does it say about you if your speech is so mediocre and predictable that it can be easily imitated by an AI, right? Like, you already failed the Turing test. I'm sorry. The Turing test is not a test of computers. The Turing test is a test of people, as far as I'm concerned. So maybe we don't even need that, right? Maybe, what will become the marker of authentic human speech is just the kinds of ways of speaking and styles that are very difficult for the AI to imitate. So I think we should not underestimate ourselves, like facing down AI. Yeah.
Jon, what do you see? So connected to AI, you talk about in your pieces about this transition from the page internet versus the feed internet, and Apple announced recently the Apple Vision Pro headset. So soon we're going to be moving increasingly, it seems, if they pull it off and there's mass adoption, to a VR, AR mediated internet. Maybe it's not quite like the transition from the page to the feed, but there's a new way to access the web. which is through these goggles. What's your sense of how that's going to shape how we interact with both reality and with each other online?
It's a great question. So I want to clarify for the audience the page feed distinction.
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Okay, so the internet was originally built was mostly sort of static web pages, HTML pages. And we don't need to go into the technical reasons why that was, but it's basically like a page of content. And you moved around the internet using hyperlinks that moved you from one page of content to another page of content. And even where you had things like forums, they were mostly ordered kind of chronologically. And you move through them. So you're moving through sort of space and time together, and you are navigating by movement, right? So it's like
you have to go
to a new page to get new information.
It's almost
right?
like a digital library, right? Where the books are all there, and you kind of have to.
Yeah, and I'm reading the Santayana essay right now, and George Santayana, and he talks about this distinction between sort of the animal and the vegetative. And you can imagine this as an animal. Like what makes the animal an animal is that it moves to acquire food, right? The feed inverts that. It's literally a vegetative mode of interaction, right? The algorithm, whatever algorithm you choose to use, brings you new content, and you consume new content in one place, basically. And this is the big change that Facebook originally made, and then the whole sort of internet has moved in this direction. And the kind of apotheosis of it in the current regime is like TikTok, where you just have your infinite feed of the best content on the internet brought right to you, and all you do is exercise judgment over whether you like it or not. But even if you say you don't like it, all it will do is bring you the next best thing.
The trough.
The trough. It's the infinite trough, right? So this is a really foundational change in how we engage with the internet, and I think largely a negative one. And there's an interesting way, right, in which the proliferation of platforms or group chats or whatever is a kind of working back towards the page in the sense of you moving to content rather than content just being kind of brought to you. Anyways, I don't know. So the question is, what does the spatial internet do to these modes of engaging with the internet and with information and content?
I mean, it kind of goes back to the previous question we were talking about, which is the internet real life or not? Something like when you watch the Apple Vision Pro promo, what it's trying to do is live right in the middle of that, where in a sense it's sort of trying to bring the internet to real life as you interact with, your glass of water.
So actually, here's an interesting thing. One of the possible affordances of AR, of augmented reality, that would constitute a new mode of engagement besides the page and the feed, is spatial computing, where which combines objects with internet engagement. So the obvious example would be like, we actually have some examples of this now. Like there are certain video games where, like AR video games. I mean, Pokemon Go is kind of the most obvious, but you could imagine a future video game where ownership of particular real physical objects creates different affordances within the game, right? Access an item or whatever. In a more complex version, you can imagine almost the creation of like a memory palace in the real world, right? Where different objects, like we got in your bookshelf, you have different books, right? It could be wearing my Apple Vision Pro, and I go and I pick up Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, and that actually unleashes information to me before I even open the book, right? Maybe it helps me decide if I want to read the book or whatever. Right. And maybe then if I do read the book, and there's a reference in there, I can click on it in my VR headset and it'll pull up the actual. So, there, I think, and that's obviously for that's a very search related modality, but you can imagine this for more personal things too, like an object. You could imbue an object with a memory or a photo or something that you would be reminded of whenever you picked it up or engaged with it. So that's a kind of computing relationship that isn't really possible today. that would be a new. But what's interesting is that doesn't seem to be Apple's vision right now. Mm-hmm. That being said, I think it's always difficult when you introduce such a new technology into the world. It's difficult. It's impossible actually to see what all the possibilities are, and so it will partially. Like when the smartphone was invented, people did not grasp how transformative the smartphone was going to be when it was first created. It created a new way of being, and then it created new value sources as a result.
Yeah, I mean, Twitter is the classic example of that. I was looking at a handle that I'm coveting of someone who's inactive, and it's just like a couple tweets from 2007 or whatever it is. He's like, I'm at the pizza parlor trying the pepperoni. That's what Twitter was.
Give me what's mine.
And now there's just like global like intellectual battles happening on this little platform that was about tweeting which street you were on.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And that's why it's interesting to see with the the Vision Pro introductory video was just extraordinary, and it is a little bit, there was a surprisingly unanimous feeling that people in tech media had about it, which I also had, which was like something awesome and kind of dark at the same point. Like it seems so clear that they've solved so many fundamental issues in virtual reality and augmented reality that this is going to work. What does this mean for us as human beings? Mm-hmm. Like to me, the most dystopian thing is what they call it eyesight. So Apple has, for the Vision Pro, they've firmly landed on the side of what's called reprojection. So rather than allowing actual photons from the real world into this headset and mixing it with artificial photons, we're just going to have a camera video of the world. Like I'm looking at you guys, I have a camera with my point of view, and it's going to reproject that, mixing it with augmented reality into my eyes. Now, that's for me. So I'm seeing you, and I'm seeing, your Facebook, your social media feeds or whatever.
Social credit score.
Yeah. Clemans and Santiago. Yours is in the dump. No, so I'm seeing your social credit score or whatever. Now, you aren't seeing anything, right? It's just like a blank screen. So that's kind of like off-putting. And so they've created the system called Eyesight, which is, they describe it as displaying your eyes. What I think it's actually going to be is displaying a model of your simulation of your eyes with eye tracking or whatever, so that you can have super high. So it's an actual external screen showing you a simulation of my eyes, so that you have something to look at as a way of facilitating two-way. But of course, you're not actually looking at my eyes, and there won't actually be any of the reflection of the little person, the pupil. This is where that term comes from. You won't actually see that. It reminds me of this line in T.S. Eliot there are no eyes here. It's just like, I don't know. It's a creepy, deeply creepy reality.
You said awesome but dark. It's feels like a very descriptive.
Yeah.
I pulled up John Stokes, mutual friend of ours. I think he had one of the best tweets on this. He said when this was right after the Apple Vision Pro announcement. He said, "I have mixed feelings about the Vision Pro. I can sum up as probably good for me personally, probably bad for society." Probably also bad for me personally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that was sort of I liked it immediately because I was like, yeah, that's how I felt. I was like, this would be awesome. I can control this. No, I can't control this. No one will be able to control this. Mm-hmm. What was interesting to me also about the Vision Pro announcement was, and this kind of goes back to a lot of your thinking about technology and how the transition between technology that's a tool that we use versus a thing that we use to blur reality into whatever we want is like when I watched that announcement, my immediate question was, somebody that comes from tech and product, and I want to, with whatever it is that I'm building, I'm wanting to solve specific problems. Mm-hmm. But when I watched that video, I immediately thought, like, what problem is this trying to solve? Like, what problem is the Apple Vision trying to solve? And it wasn't immediate. I still think about this because it wasn't immediately obvious to me what problem they're trying to solve. And to me, it's sort of, I'm curious your thoughts, but it seems like we're increasingly moving to this direction where there are tools and technology and things that are thrown at us that are highly innovative that don't necessarily solve any problems. some of there are things that they do solve and make better and enhance and whatnot. But when you think of like what technology, how we used to think about technology is you want to break open a coconut and you have to come up with tools, and you want to distribute writing, so you come up with the printing press. What problem does the Apple Vision Pro headset solve?
Isn't it obvious? It's the problem of reality. It solves reality. Like the problem of reality is constraint, right? That I actually have to connect my desires to some physical thing in time and space that has material characteristics that constrain my usage of it, right? And in a world where the important things to care about are increasingly mediated by, we say screens, but really the screen can be two things, right? A screen is a window. What we really care about is the window, right? Like when our screens are actually working, we aren't actually looking at the Corning Gorilla Glass and we're looking through them at a window into the internet, right? But before the Apple Vision Pro, reality constrained that, right? I'm holding my iPhone, right? The kind of affordances I can do with my iPhone are constrained by its form factor, right? And if I want to switch to a different form factor, like a laptop or a 80-inch TV, there are material constraints that come with that, right? I'm not going to lug around an 80-inch TV with me, so I can watch a movie in 4K high definition, and I'm not going to lug around my computer all the time. Where if I want to type a document or work, maybe work on a PowerPoint with in collaborative workspace with other people. So these different form factors for these different windows impose constraints of reality. This is also true at a bigger level too, right? If I want to have an 80-inch, if I want to watch an 80-inch TV,
by reality, you're talking about embodied.
I'm talking about embodied physical reality. Yeah. If I want to watch the Barbie movie coming to theaters near you, which I'm going to do
after Oppenheimer.
After when we're going to see Oppenheimer on the biggest screen in the DC area on Saturday, Barbie on Sunday. Shout out to my friends who are going to do this with me. So if you want to watch the Barbie movie on an 80 inch 4K high definition screen, I actually have to have a physical place where I can do that. If I'm wealthy, I can do that in my home. Not wealthy. I mean, the screens are pretty cheap these days, but I can do it in my home. But then I'm in my also like, what other constraints do I have? Constraints on my sound quality, but then also constraints on the physical environment of my apartment. So if I'm really rich, then it's a pretty good experience. But if I'm not wealthy, if I have a 500 square foot Manhattan apartment or worse, then I'm constrained by my physical environment, right? And the goal of the Apple Vision, the problem it solves is any constraint on the kinds of windows that I can have into this alternative world, right? I can sit on my couch and have a giant 100 inch, or I can sit in a couch. I can have a 100-inch theater. I can have a virtual theater. I can switch from I want a little window in the internet to a computer-sized window to do or a collaborative environment. There's no longer any connection between the kinds of windows that I can have and physical devices, other than the physical device of the constraints of the Vision Pro itself. So that's the problem that it solves.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's the phrase that comes to mind is something you used to see a lot in Silicon Valley, less so now, I think. But the democratization of XYZ, where technology is this great, we're going to democratize creator economy or things that are in the past were constrained to a particular group or a particular area of society. In some ways, it seems like what Apple Vision Pro does is it's the or AR, broadly speaking, AR, VR. If pulled off well, and then if it continues to evolve, which it will be like the great equalizing.
Although it's also maybe the darker take on it though is it's the end of.
I think that's the dark take on it to begin with.
Well, that's fair. Yes. Fair enough. Yeah, like many of these things, right? Yes. It's funny. Like I was talking to my friend Mary Harrington, and it's really interesting how the smartest analysis on all these issues on both sides of them is the exact same, and it's just like, and is it good or is it bad? Right? Like that's the only difference. Is it good or bad? Yeah. So, in some ways, it's the end of the pathway we have been on towards hyper-atomization and hyper sort of individualization, right? Because a lot of the things that the Apple Provision Pro solves because it's solving them for one person, right? We've been moving away from collaborative, social, embodied engagements for a long time. Like, it's interesting, like in the Apple Vision Pro, one of the things that people said was really creepy about it was how isolated all the individuals felt. Even though they took, they took pains to show somebody interacting with their kids using the eyesight, which again was super creepy, actually. But they're assuming that the customer is someone who is alone and wants to be alone.
Yeah,
that's the real dystopia.
That was very interesting to me. The
Yeah.
aesthetics of the apartments, they're this sort of high end San Francisco, maybe even like Stockholm, like your beautiful, like minimally. There's a particular lifestyle that was presented in that particular person that was presented in that promo. You don't see the trailer park folks, which will get this technology, wearing this.
So what's interesting, right, is that's a good point. There's an essay by Mark Andreessen called "Reality Privilege" from like last year, which I think is interesting. He makes exactly this point. It's like the people who VR is really for are not the people with the nice apartments, right? It's people living in the trailer park. And I think actually, what's it called? The Ready Player One.
Yes.
The book is better than the movie, but is a good example of this phenomenon. Here's the problem, though. Apple did not create the conditions whereby so many people ended up alone in physically depressing settings. But it is, this technology and others like it alleviates a lot of it makes it easier to not want to live differently. That, to my mind, is a great danger. And it's I don't know. You do feel like maybe you should be realistic about this. Like many people have lived. There is a real material scarcity around a lot of questions. But do we want to live in, like, what does it mean to live in a society where we have better and better ways of anesthetizing ourselves to physical scarcity instead of actually innovating and solving the physical scarcity and actually building more?
Yeah, would J.D. Vance had become a senator if he had access to Apple Vision Pro? And
that's a great question.
Dissolve reality away.
Yes.
Instead of being like, these are constraints in reality.
And it's not hypothetical, right? Like you look at why some of the best economics research on why percentage of young men in the workforce has been declining is just that, like, there are better alternatives. Like the opportunity cost of working has gone up because you can live in your parents' basement and play video games, and that's personally quite fun and interesting, at least for a while. And by the time you wake up and realize this is a terrible way to live your life, you're already in your 30s. You're probably fat. You're probably no skills, and then you're not going to get married, not going to have kids. So, there is a weird way, right, in which, like, if you look back at the world of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it's a lot of conservatives look at that time as ideal from an economic standpoint. And there was a lot to like about our political economy. But if you look at it through the lens of like media and media ecology, there was just a lot of experiences you could not have if you didn't like get up off your butt and do something interesting and go and meet people or go to a place. And a lot of what made the culture kind of vibrant and generative at the time was the kinds of associations people had just because they were bored and trying to do something interesting and they had to go do it. And now the most interesting things you can do, at least accessible to 95% of people, are things you can do on the internet.
Yeah.
That's a huge problem.
One of the pieces that about a few years ago got me thinking on this stuff, which I love, and I did some writing on it too, was we'll link it in the show notes, but the title was something like Fortnite is not a game, it's a place. And he was describing, he did a bunch of research on...
Was this Matthew Ball or who was it?
It may have been Matthew. There were a couple of essays. This was not Matthew Ball, though. I found it on Hacker News.
Okay, nice.
But the thesis of the piece was very interesting. It was was this guy basically researching this new phenomenon of Fortnite. This was maybe 2015 or 16, right when Twitch is starting to take off and Fortnite has become, Ninja has become the mainstream and all that stuff. And for parents who were entirely new to this ecology and Twitch and what's Fortnite, all this stuff, streaming, what's all taking off, they still had the perception that like maybe even I would have had or my parents would have had, which is you're just plugged into a game and you're gaming on your own. That's bad. And it's a waste of time to stand there. But so the guy writing the essay interviewed a bunch of parents who were a little bit more in tune with what their kids were doing and interviewing the kids themselves who were playing these games. And his point was that kids actually don't go to Fortnite. They weren't logging into Fortnite to play games the way the parents of those kids would have played Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 in 2008. It was instead of going to the mall or instead of going to the park and riding their bikes together, they were doing that online in Fortnite.
Absolutely.
Now, as they're chatting and as they're hanging out, they're shooting each other with the digital guns and bouncing up and down buildings and whatnot. But the fundamental thing that they were in Fortnite to do was spend time with each other. And obviously Epic they noticed this, and you had things that previously occurred in the real world, like concerts and movie premieres and trailers. Like famously, I think it was the last Star Wars movie. There was a special like deleted scenes that they showed in Fortnite only, like things that in the past you had to go to your point, you had to go to a movie theater or get access to this, that, there, line up behind, around the block at like 3 a.m. to get a seat at the launch of whatever. Now all of these things, your kid is logging into Fortnite, you're like, oh, they're playing a video game. No, they're not. They're going to a place, and later that day they're going to be shown half of the special sneak preview of Star Wars, or they're going to be in a Travis Scott concert with 3 million other kids. It's a very different heuristic for what Fortnite is than just a game.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. And this is where I think people really misunderstand kind of the metaverse as a concept. Like that's like the internet as a place is what's important about the metaverse. And to some extent, we already have the metaverse, right? Like Twitter is part of the metaverse. Like Fortnite's part of the metaverse. Yeah. If anything, I think it's been held back by too much of allegiance to like VR as a form factor. I think you can do the metaverse with consoles. I think you can do it in smartphones. And as it arrives, it will obviously have, it will, like, it's just a name for the ways that we're connected to the internet as a place. And again, there are a few things that are really important that haven't clicked in place yet. There's durable internet property and currency, internet native currency. And then there's also a certain amount of like durability of settings. Like even Fortnite as a setting, you log in and you go. It's not. It's a technical name for this, but it's not like a permanent setting, right? You still are going to servers, and the servers are regenerated every time you play a different game. You go to a different server, even if you're with your friends. It is. There are already games that are working towards a more kind of permanent setting.
Where all the players are in the same world. Because in Fortnite, you're like syndicated, basically sharded out.
Exactly. And so as we get to that point, then it becomes possible to take the internet as a place more and more seriously. Yeah.
I mean, that you mentioned Ready Player One, like that environment already exists in a huge way for a lot of people.
Exactly. Yeah, it's exactly right.
I was involved with managing a building, houses a lot of like college students and guys in their 20s. And again, it's like those small, like 500 square foot type of apartments, self-contained. And right now, like those guys are in there, a lot of them, they've got their gaming rig and they're plugged in most of the time. They can do DoorDash or they can work for a fast food restaurant, 20 hours a week tops, and they can earn enough to keep their whole rig going, and they live in that gaming world. Like that's happening right now.
Yeah, this is the thing this is the thing people really don't understand. It's like we're already here. Yeah. It just, again, it's not evenly distributed.
The future is now.
And it will only get more appealing, right? Because right now, what the benefits that you're getting out of playing a ton of Call of Duty or NBA, 2K Live or whatever you're into are just the fun of engaging in that world, right? It doesn't have any. Again, it doesn't lead to anything. It doesn't build on anything. And for a lot of these guys, like eventually, that's kind of what pulls them into the real world. Is you can only for better or for worse, right now on the internet, you can only build so much within the world of the internet as it is, especially in the world of games. But we're not far off from a world in which there's no obvious ending. I mean, some like MMORPGs are kind of already there, like EVE Online or World of Warcraft famously. Mm-hmm. But when you add on durable internet property, when you add on durable reputations and durable identity, then suddenly, and again, you can see this a little bit with like famous Twitch streamers now, where you have a gamer tag that's recognized and valuable. You have an audience through Twitch. Yeah. And then suddenly it becomes possible to make a living online. Yeah.
The next step would be like a portable protocol where you could take your audience maybe from one platform to another.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're already pretty close to it.
Win in one game, maybe.
Because again, right now the constraint is you have to log off to work, and now that will probably, for a number of reasons, that will probably always be the case for most people. But what does it mean to live in a world in which you can build meaningful value on the internet, in addition to all the other things that are already on the internet, including relationships, including fun and games, including DoorDash and so food and other things like that. Like, for many people, you already never have to log off. And in fact, even that notion, like to some extent, that's a big difference between millennials and Zoomers, is like millennials grew up in a world where you did log off and where it was good to log off. And now for many Zoomers, like they're never really offline.
Yeah. John, what do you, as you're talking, I'm thinking about one of the other aspects of the internet that is very explicit to me, is the explicitly clear, but to me is this kind of the collapse of the distance between your average person, the everyman, and the elite class. Somebody like, you're a user on Twitter and you can interact with Elon Musk, he can quote tweet you, he can subscribe to you. Fast forward even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, those people are away in their ivory towers, where you're the everyman interacting here. Now you have the capacity to, I think of Ready Player One, where, and stories or games like it, where you assemble this army that's almost inconceivable. You get your favorite characters from this movie and the CEO of that company that you like and the big hero of that book, and everybody kind of gets together and you go take on a quest and destroy the enemy. What do you, if you've thought about this, like, what do you think it's done to us, that distance between sort of the general population, the everyman, they've gone closer to the elite class, the CEOs, venture capitalists, politicians? How has that shaped how we perceive reality as well?
That's an interesting question. I kind of want to challenge the premise. It's not clear to me that we have gotten closer. Mm-hmm. Like, there used to be this thing called the postal mail. You could actually send a letter to a politician or a celebrity or whatever, and sometimes they actually read those letters and responded. So what's become different? Well, there's an element of kind of performativity about, I mean, people who write more about this dimension of it are smarter than I am, but like kind of the parasocial relationship of a kind of relationship that's cultivated through the internet as part of kind of building an audience, building a fandom. And in many cases, it might even not be the actual person who's doing it, right? Maybe somebody who works for them. So that's an important difference. Certainly the barriers to, if someone, an elite wants to get involved in some way, probably the barriers to them doing that have gone down. There's a good article by Venkatesh Rao called The Internet of Beefs that I think explores some of these dynamics in the way that, but I guess there's also a question of like, where is their power from? Like, I think people who are elite in part because of their online following have and do maintain a different kind of relationship to their followers and to the internet than people whose power comes from somewhere else. And I think maybe one of the problems in our era is that we've gotten confused about this. Like, as a good example of like, on the internet, AOC was like way more powerful than Nancy Pelosi, right? If you want to make anything happen on the internet, draw attention to an issue or whatever, AOC was way more powerful. But in terms of the real world, Nancy Pelosi is far more powerful. Anybody in DC kind of knew that. And So the temptation, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, the temptation is to believe that the internet, that real life isn't real life, to forget that there are other ways of holding and having power that are illegible to the internet. Yeah. So I think that's true for our elites as well. I think it's a mistake to think that because somebody has a Twitter account that they're like easier to connect with.
Yeah, that makes sense. John, I want to kind of hop to another topic that you've written a lot about and thought about, drones, strategic warfare, technology in the military. But it kind of, to me, as I was thinking about this conversation, there seems to be some overlap between reality as a game and drones, at least in some of the stuff I've read. I remember back when The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald and all those guys released the drone papers, and a lot of the interviews with these pilots were talking about how, again, these are guys kind of our age who grew up on Call of Duty and whatnot, and all of a sudden they were in the skiff in Arizona, interacting with a real world in a way that framed it for them as a game, and the interesting kind of psychological responses that they had. Through
so
that.
This is a common claim that's made on the left, and I don't think it's. To be frank, I think it's really lazy analysis, and I don't think it's actually empirically supported. So in conducting, the preferred term is like RPA, remotely piloted aircraft, right? Whether it's close air support or more like targeted strikes. Yeah, I think the most important thing to realize is how much more fidelity and dwell time a drone pilot has compared to a manned aircraft pilot. And it actually, in some ways, it increases the emotional intensity of engaging in combat that way because you're not distracted by all the other tasks of actually flying an aircraft at 500 miles per hour, right? So like an F-18 pilot doing close air support, like, yes, he's hooked into the ground through a radio network. He's there and something he can look around or whatever, but he's also flying an aircraft, which is a hard thing to do. He's got a tiny screen where he's controlling the laser or whatever for the bomb or the missile that he's using. There's a lot of other things to distract you in that situation. In an RPA system, you're moving a lot slower. You don't worry about your physical danger, and so you have and you also have much higher definition sensors and screens than the manned pilot has in front of you. In many cases, your dwell time over the airspace is a lot longer. So like depending on where he's coming from, the F-18 pilot only has enough gas for 30 minutes, an hour tops over a combat space. And in a battle that can take, in Afghanistan, these battles could last all day, basically. In case of an airstrike, mostly you're just coming over to just drop the bomb, right? Whereas RPA pilots are doing missions that are significantly longer. You easily, 8-hour, 12-hour missions in some cases, individually. Not to mention the, how long in some cases, an intelligence gathering capacity over a long span of time, right? One of the tasks that RPA pilots helped with, along with like targeting analysts, were pattern of life assessments. So like, you're monitoring an individual who's part of a terrorist network. You're trying to figure out like what they're up to, who they're meeting with, or whatever. So over a span of a couple of weeks, you're watching this guy 24/7
do everything.
Right. Yeah, and so even if he's a bad guy, you still develop an extreme level of intimacy and familiarity with his life or whatever, right? And so when you're then asked to blow him up you'll even that, like even if you get an order to like time to take this guy out, right? It's not like instant, right? Part of the virtue of having the pattern of life is you can find the moment where there's least collateral damage, or ideally zero collateral damage, right? So then you're watching him. You're on this mission. You're going to target this guy who's, an enemy of the United States involved in a terrorist network. And you're watching him like have his breakfast, play with his kids, kiss his wife goodbye and get on a car. And then you're going to blow the car up. So if you actually talk to a few people with ideological priors, gave some interviews to people like Glenn Greenwald and talked about it being like a video game, but that's just completely false to the reality of what that experience is like.
What got you into this kind of thinking, writing, and work?
Well, I think for a long time ago, I was when I was an undergrad actually at Georgetown, I got to know some folks who were RPA pilots, and based on my work on technology, my interest in Heidegger and kind of phenomenology, like it became clear to me that the international relations work on this subject was completely off base and wrong and surface level, that there's a lot more depth to get into. And so that's kind of when I began thinking about these subjects.
Interesting. What was off base about it? Was it
exactly. It was stuff like this. It was stuff like, for one thing, it was the assumption that because the pilot is physically distant from the aircraft, that necessarily translates to an ethical distance or an emotional distance. In many cases, they were treating the drone. You still see this, treating the drones as the interesting thing, as opposed to the remoteness. So what's interesting about a Predator drone is not that it's a robot flying over the battlefield. We've had these things called cruise missiles for a long time, right? What's interesting is that it's remotely piloted, right? So, and the analysis is focusing on the least interesting thing about it, which was we have a robot flying over a battlefield and not the remotely piloted component of it or how it's actually used in operations or the intelligence gathering. They're focusing on completely the wrong issue because they were operating this kind of killer drones paradigm, right? So that's kind of why I got interested in the issue. And it's still interesting now because now we actually have, like even now as we have more artificial intelligence and more capability to do autonomous vehicles, people are still focusing on the wrong things. This is a classic problem in technology analysis I call it the horseless carriage problem, right? If you're calling something the horseless carriage, you don't know what it is, right? You're applying the old paradigm to a new thing, right? And some might say the same about post-liberalism as well. Like as an idea, like if you're calling it post something, it means you have no idea what's coming next. Similarly, like really autonomous drones are not going to be like a Predator drone with an AI doing stuff instead of the human, right? It's actually going to be a completely different artifact. It's going to network and be used in operations in very different ways. And so I'm working with some folks at the Air Force who are kind of at the forefront of thinking about these questions. And it's kind of I think it's a way more interesting discussion than the like killer drones question.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, it's all about like, how do you mediate reality and how, to your point just now, when you layer in a new technology over something so complex, it's not just the previous thing plus
that's right.
the upgrade.
Yeah.
It's a completely new thing.
That's right. Yeah. And that's true with the technology. That's true for the organizations as well. Neil Postman has a great line that, after the printing press, it wasn't just Europe, old Europe plus the printing press. It was a new Europe. Like it created a new kind of society.
Yeah.
And
that's, I guess that's kind of brings us back to the internet and social media platforms, et cetera. It's not just us with a smartphone or with a Twitter account. It's
yeah. Well, I loved your example earlier was so perfect. It's like Twitter 2007 is like I'm going for a pepperoni pizza, right? And even then, that's like building off of the Facebook status. Yeah. And I don't know. It's an interesting question. Like, what was the Facebook status building off of? You know what? Actually, Facebook status is building off of like the AIM away message or whatever, like the little message you could put on AIM or whatever. Mm-hmm. Like I think that's what Facebook. So it's playing off of that. And then fast forward 10 years, and it's like geopolitical debates between like global meme warfare. Yeah. Like Mark Zuckerberg fighting Elon, like getting from like I'm going for a pepperoni pizza to Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are going to fight in the octagon, like
Coliseum.
Last time. Yeah, the Coliseum. Yeah, it's just like it's completely. It's a different world.
What's funny is I started my Twitter account 2011.
Nice.
I used it for maybe a year.
Yeah.
This was during I'm gonna go to get a pizza, and then I was like, this is pointless. This is dumb. And I was building a startup at the time. I got busy with other things, so I stopped using it. And then I reactivated it during 2020 because I heard like that's Twitter is one of the places where you can get, even under the old regime, could get some slivers of truth about what was going on. And just that gap between 2011 activating Twitter, fast forward less than 10 years later, it was an entirely different experience. I mean, I got my job at New Founding through Twitter.
Yeah.
Whereas 10 years ago, that would have been conceivable. 10 years before that, it was a different thing. People were still trying to figure out, like, what do we wrestle this tool into?
Yes.
What do we make it? What do we turn it into?
Well, it takes time for the sort of new media environment to work itself out. Again, this is, I think, one of the great flaws in kind of a lot of analysis of the internet is it tries to pin it down to like a very small moment in time. It doesn't see it as a process. Like, again, the printing press took, the printing press took a century to cause the 30 Years' War, right? Like, we've got a long time to go before the internet has reworked every other kind of human institution, which it is going to do.
So as we wind down, we're moving away from reality that was vastly shaped by print media and like human communities in that regard, like real communities, and moving to something else. What are we moving toward?
Well, you say the internet. So I don't think, certainly by the late. So the world of broadcast media, where you have the mass production of information from a single source to a mass audience. Right. That creates a world of consensus reality. That is actually a world that's much less shaped by local community than the kinds of reality we had beforehand. My essay, What Was the Fact?, I think does a good job getting into this. In some ways, we're actually recovering an older idea that connects facts and information about reality to particular speakers, particular communities, particular ways of seeing the world, right? Just rather than being localities or physical localities, those are internet localities. So, I think we're still early on in building out what this looks like. And I think one promising thing, right, is that in the same way that small liberal institutions were built to handle metaphysical differences after the Reformation, after the printing press, like, I think we will build institutions that use digital systems to help mediate some of these kind of factual disagreements, right? This is, I think, what's interesting about cryptocurrency, what's interesting about some ways of verifying, for example, like voting procedures using automated systems, is like you can actually disagree about a lot of other facts if you agree about the kind of underlying digital process that verifies encryption and verifies the protocol. And so I think that, one interesting thing that kind of comes about at the same time as this digital civilization is the kind of rise of protocols. And so I think that that's going to be a really important feature in the kind of post-consensus reality. So we'll agree on the protocol, we won't agree on the content, and we'll generate reality based on trust and authority and reputation within particular communities that share fundamental values.
Yeah, but now we're talking about New Founding talent, our talent placement platform. Yeah,
that's right. I think you guys are at the forefront. I think New Founding is at the forefront of institutions that are thinking about what the future is going to look like.
Yeah,
and not
part
just
of it is recovering what's going to become scarce.
Yes, exactly. Recovering what's going to become scarce.
Yeah, trust-based systems. Recommendations and credentialing by other individuals. When you stake credibility in somebody, you recommend them. That's going to become increasingly scarce, and if somebody can capture it, Josh, and
that's right,
scale that, then we can.
Absolutely,
there's a real opportunity.
Absolutely,
to arbitrage that.
Yeah, I think as we go forward, especially with generative AI, I think the question of like what has become scarce is one of the most important things you can ask analytically. And you're going to find value in scarcity.
That's where the opportunities will
Absolutely.
be. Yeah. So, John, last couple of questions we ask everybody, but these as they relate to your field of study. The black pill and the white pill question. So, in your field of study, as you look at the internet, look at consensus reality or the breaking of consensus reality, what's worse than most people realize?
Oh man, that's a great question. That's a really good question. I mean, I think the fragmentation is going to go much deeper than it already has. Like, I think we're still living in some ways in the afterglow of mass media.
The fragmentation of different realities that people are participating
in. The sense of what is factually true. Our ability to agree on what is factually true.
Like you think it's fragmented now, just wait a few more years.
That's right. Yeah. That's exactly right. So I think that would be maybe about black pill.
Okay. What about the white pill? What's better than most people realize?
I think what's better is I think that the world of consensus reality was a lot worse than people remember. If you go back and read stuff and look at stuff, there's so much that got airbrushed away by today we'd call it establishment media, but just the media. So much that was wrong. That was a product of conspiracies. Like I'm not talking about big conspiracy theories, but like I mean the word conspiracy comes from like to breathe together, right? Just like small networks of gatekeepers that got to decide what was and wasn't important. That shaped, and those judgments shaped the lives of millions of people. I mean, one example is like population control and like the population bomb myth, right? Like a lot of people in mid-century America became convinced that the earth was like about to be overpopulated, and they owned all the media companies. So it was kind of became kind of elite consensus, and it led to mass sterilization programs in India. It shaped the contraception programs in Africa. It shaped the one-child policy. It's almost single-handedly responsible, it's hugely responsible for the kind of population cliff that the world is going to be facing in the 21st century. That level of media of control over consensus reality is impossible now. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think we agree. It's certainly fun.
It's certainly fun, and it's a lot more fun.
Back where we started.
Oh man, it's so much more fun. Yeah.
If you're not on the internet, you're missing out.
Absolutely.
So with that, Jon, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.